Welcome to Produce Talks.
This whole business is based on relationship and friendships.
Food is darn simple.
What can we do? What are other countries doing?
How important it is for industry to be talking about this.
We're going back to the farm. We're going back to the whole food.
Hello, and welcome to Produce Talks, the CPMA podcast. I'm Wally Burns, the Education and Training Manager at CPMA. Today, we are pleased to welcome CPMA's Sue Lewis and Mike Mauti, Managing Partner of Execulytics Consulting, as they discuss the recently released CPMA Canadian Marketplace Annual Report. This report provides a comprehensive overview of the Canadian produce market for 2021. They discuss consumer trends in Canada, the growth of Canadian greenhouse grown, and the consumer perceptions about organic produce. Mike also uses his crystal ball to look at 2022 and beyond. CPMA would like to acknowledge Nature Fresh Farms as our Produce Talks series sponsor. Find out more about Nature Fresh Farms and how they are growing for a kinder future at www.naturefresh.ca. You can keep up with them on Instagram or Twitter at nature_fresh and on Pinterest at naturefresh, along with other social media. CPMA would also like to welcome Fresh from Florida as a sponsor of this podcast. Here is a quick message from Chef Justin of Fresh from Florida.
Hi, I'm Chef Justin Timoneri, Executive Chef with Fresh from Florida, a proud sponsor of this podcast. Fresh from Florida loves being a part of CPMA and sharing the message of what Florida farmers bring to the table. To learn more and to find hundreds of Florida Fresh recipes that we develop for you in our test kitchen, visit followfreshfromflorida.com and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Fresh from Florida. Enjoy the show and keep cooking.
And now, here is CPMA Vice President Sue Lewis discussing the 2021 CPMA Canadian Marketplace Annual Report with Mike Mauti.
Thank you, Wally. Good morning, Mike. Let's start with a pretty basic question here. Why do you think it's important that we do research and collect data specific for the Canadian market?
Well, good morning, Sue. And that's a good question. The one thing is we operate in a very fluid industry, and we get influences from many different areas across that industry, whether it be from different countries or different parts of the industry, like the food service part of the industry. And of course, different circumstances on the ground will also influence parts of the industry. And of course, the big one right now is the pandemic that we're living through. And so it's important to take a look at all these changing elements in the produce business to uncover different trends that are happening across the industry and ensuring that we're on top of those trends, satisfying our customers who are demanding different things because of these trends. But then it is also important to ensure that we're putting our investment dollars in the right spot in order to satisfy those demands caused by these differing trends across the industry.
And I think, Mike, sometimes people assume that if something's trending in the US or elsewhere in the world, it automatically translates to Canada. Would you say that's the case always?
Well, not always, but typically a lot of these trends do start in areas that perhaps have a bigger media market than Canada. And we get a lot of media from across the border. So we'll see a lot of what's going on in different restaurants through commercials, or these days a lot through social media. So while it's not an exact science that whatever is going on in the United States or in Europe or abroad is going to happen in Canada, but it's also a pretty good bet that eventually it will happen in Canada.
Let's talk for a minute about the greenhouse sector in Canada. It's a very strong part of our supply chain and growing. How does this greenhouse sector contribute to the overall produce scene?
Well, I think for starters, you're right in saying it is a large part of the produce industry in Canada. And that in and of itself can't be taken away from all the different impacts it has on it. The sheer size of the greenhouse sector in the produce industry in Canada is so massive that it gives Canada a larger voice on the international markets. You'd be hard pressed, particularly within North America, to find a big buyer who hasn't purchased Canadian greenhouse product. So just the fact that 52 weeks out of the year, large buyers, particularly in the United States, are buying produce from Canada, it keeps Canada on the front burner with respect to partnerships and whatnot. But also because it's so big within Canada, it also gives the produce industry a larger voice on the domestic agenda. So when it comes to developing different regulations or innovations in things like packaging or whatnot, the fact that greenhouse is so large gives the produce industry a larger voice in that arena too. And then from a consumer perspective, it really drives some really big consumer pillars such as local. Across Canada, there are finite local growing seasons. And during those time periods, of course, local becomes a very hot button issue. But because greenhouse typically supplies product 52 weeks a year, it keeps that local message front and center with consumers across the entire year. And then, of course, certain elements of innovation, such as packaging innovation, varietal innovation, a lot of that is driven by the greenhouse industry. And you could almost say that the whole consumer movement towards flavorful varieties really has its genesis in Canada in the greenhouse industry.
And we certainly know that local is a very important topic for Canadian consumers, especially during the pandemic. I think there is a level of comfort to people to buy local produce. So to your point, this sector certainly helps us achieve that goal as consumers. But we do have a strong export market for our Canadian produce. The US is typically our strongest trading partner. But what makes Canadian produce so attractive to these trading partners?
Well, this won't come as a big revelation to many Canadians, but outside of Canada, I think a lot of people are very surprised when they look on a map and see just how big Canada is. And so I call that Canada's geographical might. And if you look across the country, starting, say, with the West, and take a look at some of the growing programs that they have in the West, namely, the BC stone fruit programs or blueberry programs. And then you take it all the way across the country and you look at PEI potatoes as being a very strong program in and of itself. And in between those two extremes, you've got very diverse growing areas in Quebec and Ontario. And then, we've already talked about it, but across the country, there are greenhouse programs that are very formidable. And many times those programs have very close proximity to some very major US markets. And so a lot of times those programs are easier to get a hold of with an awful lot less food mileage associated with them. When you think about coming from California to New York, you're talking about 300 miles or 5,000 kilometers compared to just 500 kilometers from Montreal or Toronto. So being that close to such major markets in the United States makes these programs, which are world-class, very attractive to those marketplaces. And
where do you see emerging opportunities for our exporters?
Well, we keep going back to the same drum, but there continues to be significant opportunities in the greenhouse sector. And now, if I were to take out my crystal ball and look 10 years down the road, I would bet that there are going to be a handful or a number of produce varieties that today we typically consider to be field-grown varieties. 10 years from now, it wouldn't surprise me to see that some of those products are grown alongside or perhaps even almost exclusively in a greenhouse. So there are a lot of different opportunities still to be tapped into when it comes to greenhouse or even the broader controlled environment sector. And then outside of that, there's a significant amount of interest in Canadian mushrooms, and Canadian sweet potatoes is something that's getting a lot of interest abroad as well. So I see a varied set of opportunities, but those three in particular, I think are something that we should keep our eyes on.
Okay, well, you said crystal ball, so I'm going to put you on the spot and say, can you give us one example of what you think field-grown vegetable or fruit might pop up in greenhouse?
Yeah, Of course, if I knew that answer, I'd probably be doing something different. But if you think about what's been successful already today in the greenhouse outside of tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, you might get a little bit of an insight into what you could see perhaps 10 years from now. And so if I were to take a stab at it, I would say continued growth in the berry categories. So maybe we might see raspberries grown an awful lot more in greenhouses, or maybe even start to see blueberries. And then I also think of, some of the products that are similar to tomatoes or cucumbers. And I think, maybe green beans might be a product that would lend itself well to greenhouse. So if I were to take a stab, I wouldn't be surprised to see raspberries and green beans as two key items that we might see in a greenhouse 10 years from now.
Okay, we'll keep that one in the vault, and we can say you heard it here first.
That's right.
Are there any markets or countries in particular that we should be paying special attention to for our exports, Mike?
When it comes to exports, we definitely cannot take our eye off of the U.S. 19 out of every $20 spent on Canadian export produce goes to the United States. And every year, the United States grows its Canadian program more than all other countries combined. So we can't talk about Canadian exports without talking about the United States. Now, that being said, there are a handful of countries that are growing their programs faster than the United States, not in absolute terms, but in the rate of growth. Countries like Japan or the Netherlands, Israel, and Poland are all growing their programs at a faster clip than the United States. So those are four countries that I think we could take a look at over the next number of years to look for new programs to develop.
Okay. We couldn't come to the end of 2021 without talking about some of the supply chain challenges affecting the industry. This past year, Canada imported over $10 billion in fresh produce. So what do you think is going to be the effect of those challenges on our imports over the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, when you think about supply chain challenges, what that generally means is it's hard to get product into our marketplace. And so the two big things that's going to impact is availability and cost. And when it comes to availability, I think it's reasonable to assume that over the next 6 months to a year, you'll be seeing some empty shelves. You're probably going to be seeing some niche type products unavailable in certain stores. But the one thing about the produce industry is we always find a way. And so even though these products are perhaps going to be intermittent from time to time or not available in every store, they still will be coming into Canada. They might be a little bit more expensive because the cost of logistics has grown in leaps and bounds over the last year. So you're definitely going to see them more expensive, but I would say that you will still see them. And if you go to different stores that focus on assortment, I think you're still going to be able to find them. So if you're interested in lychee fruit, I think you're still going to be able to buy lychee fruit in this marketplace. It just might be a little bit more expensive, and it might not be available at every store.
Okay. Looking at the Canadian consumer, would you say there's such a thing as a typical Canadian consumer?
Well, there is, and I would describe that typical consumer as someone who purchases somewhat less, or I should say consumes somewhat less than 4 servings of fruit and vegetables a day, and they're quite price sensitive. And that's a pretty good description of the typical produce customer. And with that, we've been able to create a pretty vibrant marketplace as that being a typical customer. And if you want to maintain or perhaps even grow that customer, it's going to be very important to be right on price. So that doesn't mean that you're not able to pass along inflation to consumers or be profitable in your business. But it does mean that you're going to have to keep a very mindful look at pricing within a marketplace to ensure that you are right on price. And then, of course, ensuring that the product being offered to this typical customer is of the right quality. Because they're consuming what we would consider a smaller amount of produce, we have to make sure that what we're offering them is the right price. Now, that's the typical consumer. Not every consumer is like that. There is another consumer out there. This is the one that really favors fruits and vegetables. They're consuming up to maybe 10 servings a day. And they're really out there looking for new varieties, new ways to prepare food. These are the real innovators in our marketplace. And a lot of times it is this group of people that generate the growth in our marketplace. So while it's important to keep your eye on the typical consumer who is purchasing the bulk of produce in our marketplace, in order to maintain your growth engine, you have to continue to satisfy these innovators or these more atypical consumers who are consuming a much larger amount of produce per capita than the typical consumer. So it's important to satisfy both of these.
Mike, I know in your research you look a lot at various demographics. Would you say there's any specific generation or demographic that really jumps out as being an opportunity for the sector to target to try and increase those servings above that level of 4 a day?
Well, it really seems that the younger generations are more in tune with not just consumption, but also some of the more advanced concepts in the produce industry. So we started out with the millennial generation that were very comfortable with the idea of organics. And ever since that generation started to grow in their purchasing power in the grocery store, we started to see pretty significant increases in organic penetrations across the industry. And every year as that group increased their purchasing power, so too did the penetration of organic produce. And we're seeing the same thing with the generation younger than the millennials, the Generation Zs. They are even more inclined to purchase organic produce. And the same can be said about things like sustainably sourced produce or the controlled environment produce. So all these concepts that are emerging in the produce industry resonate better with the younger generation. And that tells me that they're interested in a more balanced, healthy lifestyle that is a little bit more focused on fruits and vegetables. And so to continue to focus on younger people and providing the fruits and vegetables that they're interested in, teaching them how to prepare them in different ways, I think is going to pay dividends in the future.
And you mentioned that price sensitivity is one of the big factors for your Canadian shoppers. How does that translate into these generations wanting to choose sustainably sourced and organic? Are they willing to pay a price premium for those options?
They are willing to pay a price premium more so than some of the older generations, but I would say that they are also price sensitive. Although they're price sensitive within the types of products that they want to purchase, so they might be more comfortable purchasing organics or sustainably sourced produce, but even within those categories, they remain price sensitive.
I know in some of our research we've done together, Mike, we've talked to typical quote unquote consumers about produce brands. And we've seen that most people in Canada have a hard time naming some produce brands.
Yes.
What advice would you offer to the sector to try and boost that up or give them a leg up when they're looking at how to promote their product to Canadians?
Well, it's a challenging question, simply because when you think of branding in the marketplace, a lot of times the brand is the indicator of the product you're going to get. So an indicator of the quality of the product. So when you buy a Coca-Cola, you know that brand, you know what that brand stands for, and you know the quality that you're going to get in that product. When it comes to a fresh produce product, the brand doesn't speak to the customer in terms of the quality because they have something much closer to them that speaks to the quality, and that's the product itself. They can look at it, they can feel it, they can smell it, they can understand the quality of the product. They also understand that that quality is not static from one day to the next. So that is a significant roadblock to branding in the produce business. So to get around that, the answer is just making sure that whatever that brand stands for is delivered upon. So if it's going to be the best tasting tomato in the marketplace, then it has to deliver the best tasting tomato time and time again so that people remember that brand. If it's going to be a brand that stands for superior value across a category, then that value has to consistently be superior to competing products. And value doesn't just mean price, it also means quality. So you can pay a low price for poor quality, but if you're standing for a low price for acceptable quality, then it's got to be that acceptable quality time and time again. Otherwise, people won't remember that brand. And so it's a little bit trickier in produce, but it can be accomplished if you deliver on the promise that brand is making to the customer.
Great advice. Thank you. Well, with 2022 just around the corner, it's time to get that crystal ball back out. Although the world seems to be changing almost on a daily basis these days, any predictions for the sector for the coming year?
Well, I do like to get out my crystal ball from time to time. Unfortunately, it's a little bit fuzzy, but it is good to get it out. I think that what we can expect, at least in the short term, is we're going to continue to see inflation. And I would suggest that we're going to see inflation for the better part of 2022, at least until we cycle over some of the supply chain disruptions that caused the inflation. So probably we're going to see it until about the fourth quarter of 2022. And then the other thing that I'm seeing is this reemergence of value-added produce. When we were in the thick of the pandemic, or in the early stages of the pandemic, and food service was closing across the country, people gravitated towards cooking at home because they really had no other choice. And a lot of categories that grew during this time period were categories that I would consider replacements for restaurant meals. So some of the multicultural vegetables or exotic fruits, things that you would oftentimes satisfy at a food service location or at a restaurant, people were satisfying in the grocery store. And on top of that, people were also getting reacquainted with the kitchen and learning new skills in the kitchen. And as we progressed through the pandemic, a couple of things happened. First of all, restaurants started to reopen, but some of these old habits stuck. So the increase in some of these niche-y type categories like multicultural vegetables or exotic fruit remained. But I also sense that people were starting to get a little bit of cooking fatigue, and things in their life got busy again as they were juggling school and work and whatnot. But those core demands for these niche type categories remained. So I think we're going to see a reemergence of value-added produce, which took a bit of a hit during the early parts of the pandemic. But it's going to reemerge in some of these niche type categories that people have now become accustomed to or have grown a new demand for. So things like these multicultural vegetables or tropical fruits or specialty fruits or exotic fruits, I think we're going to see those products emerging into the value-added arena. And so, perhaps in the next year, 18 months, 2 years, we're going to see a bit of an expansion in those types of products.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of predictions that the cooking from home trend may swing back a little bit, but that people have really gotten into it and are enjoying it and realizing that there's lots of great benefits for themselves, for their family, for like financially as well as nutritionally. So it'll be interesting to see if that new pattern holds true.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Well, Mike, we've come to the end of our time here. I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us today.
My pleasure.
CPMA members can download the 2021 Canadian Marketplace Annual Report in its entirety at community.cpma.ca. Log in and you'll find it on the main page. Until next time, I'm Sue Lewis for Produce Talks. Remember to fill half your plate with fruits and veggies, continue to seek out new knowledge, and basically never stop growing.